my God, so hot.
So I work in an NGO called Human Asia,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm working in a development cooperation team. So like what I do is I plan and implement projects that, like providing things like education for like children in the developing countries, mainly like in Asia. Yeah.
That's very cool, man. You seem to be doing a lot of great things with your life already. I'm old and you
Thank you.
make me feel bad about all the things you're doing. How did you how did you get into the NGO? I know a lot of people in South Korea, especially high school students and that, they have to do like mandatory volunteer work, which is kind of a
Yeah.
contradiction, right? But I guess that's not what you're doing. How did you get into the NGO work, Youngwoo?
Well, so I was trying to look for some like career opportunities because even if I'm still in my undergrads, I was looking for maybe work experience that I can that is compatible with like my university courses so that I can like go to work but at the same time like kind of part-time work and then, go to school for 2 or 3 days a week. And then so I started as an intern in the NGO that I'm currently working in, but then I fortunately got promoted as a regular employee. So I think that's how I got more involved in NGO works from then, from this, actually this summer. Yeah.
Have you been to any of the locations? Have you been to any of the developing countries that you're trying to help? Oh.
Uh, well, not yet necessarily because not only me, but my organization was not able to travel because of COVID restriction, not only in Korea, but also in the countries that we're doing projects. But I might be able to go to Jordan in October, but we'll have to see about that. Yeah, re like regarding these schedules and like budgets and things like that.
Sounds like a fantastic experience, man. Going to Jordan
Yeah.
in October. Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Um, well, let's turn this conversation, I guess, towards the work that you've been doing. Because I came across your work about a month ago when I had to read through some papers for the Asia Society competition, and your one your one it won the whole competition, right? So there's this event, it's judged by the ambassadors from the EU, from Singapore, from Israel, and all of these smart PhD students, master's students, they're writing about international relations and they're writing about geopolitics and nuclear energy, and you just crush the whole competition, get first place, huge financial gains from it. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you.
I voted for you. But what was interesting to me is that you were addressing like the LGBT community and you were addressing contemporary Korean issues rather than these sort of big grander, regional things. So why was it that topic? What drew you to looking at, let's say, the LGBT community in South Korea, Youngwoo?
So actually I had like my previous experiences or my field of interest already lied in the gender sociology, I guess more like in the context of Korea as well. I think that like I think that the pitch that I had for applying for the Asia Society Voice of Youth, I knew that a lot of applicants are actually more focused on things like international politics or international relations, like regional politics and things like that. Which was what like a concern that I had that like intuitively because my topic is a little bit different from other, you know, participants. So um but I think that I still wanted to participate for the fact that as an undergraduate student, there's not a lot of research opportunity that I can do. And it's even when it comes to things like essay competition or paper competition, there are a lot of pre-designated topics. So there's not a lot of like chance for me to do research on the topic and themes that I am genuinely interested in, especially in the field of social science and like queer politics or queer sociology, things like that. So that was why I was still willing to participate, and fortunately I had a good result. But even aside from that, I think that I did really enjoy um all the things that I was able to do, because it was almost the first opportunity or a first time for me to um do an actual research. So even if I like did write some essays and things like that in my courses, I think that doing actual analytical research was it was the first time for me to do that, and it was really fun. And I think I realized that um maybe I do have some passion in the academia that I might be able to pursue in the future as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it was your work and your research and your methodology and your writing that made you win. It wasn't necessarily because of the topic. I think that just added an extra dimension to it. You said this passion for sociology, perhaps for queer studies and gender. That's definitely becoming a huge part of day-to-day life in North America, in Western Europe. I think less so in South Korea, so I'd like to try to unpack some of those ideas. When you were looking at the LGBT community for your research, obviously it's not just one community that's monolith, right? Inside the community, you've got lots of different people and groups and political persuasions and young and old. Did you find anything during your research of interest or of noteworthy about the LGBT community in Korea?
So I think that during my research, I think it was more focused on like the Protestant institutions. But if I were to maybe look back on my research, I did interview the activists that are currently very prominent in Korean queer scene. And the questions and the discussions that I had with them were actually quite interesting. So for example, I asked them, so where do you think all these like hate and like hatred or things like misunderstanding, misconception all came from? And what I heard from them was that it's not only the matter of like, for example, Bible saying that like, being gay is a sin or being gay is a bad thing, but it's also very much related to the political conditions and social circumstances that pushes these institutions to hate like gay community or queer community. And I think that was the premise from which I started my research, that it might not be only the problem, or it might not be the factor of Bible or religious scripts or certain like norms or things like that, but it has to be approached from a sociological perspective, taking into account the positions of these institutions politically, what are the like things like political leanings and things like that. And how does that affect the political or social stances of these institutions against the, by and large, queer rights or queer issues, and specifically in my research, the comprehensive anti-discrimination law. So I think that was one thing that I found a little bit more in depth as I was doing my research, that this should be approached from a social perspective. Yeah.
It's really interesting you say it's not just about theological studies or verses in the Bible, because for example, Western Europe has a much longer Christian tradition, has kings and queens, and gay marriage and all that is absolutely fine there, despite a much longer and more historied tradition of Christianity in those cultures. So it's not necessarily just Christianity itself, and that's why I think your research is good. You're looking at the sociological and the political influences on this. Perhaps just before we get there, just to try to stay on the community a bit, I just mentioned that, for example, my international students at the universities, they'll send me emails with pronouns in their bios and things like this, or they'll ask me now to refer to them as a different gender in class amongst the international students. And I'm old, it takes some getting used to, but I'm going with the flow as best I can. What is it like in Korea, from your perspective, amongst young Korean people? Like, amongst the isiptes or something, or people in their 20s, is there a big focus on gender and identity and sexuality and that kind of thing? What's your take on that?
I would say that there's a very lack of awareness in terms of, you know, by the sheer fact that there can be different gender identity or sexual orientation.
Mm.
Even for me, when I was participating in other like programs with students from like United States, I noticed that they put their gender pronoun in the parentheses in their Zoom, names and things like
Yeah.
that. So that was really interesting for me. And even when I went to California earlier this year, when I was trying to, register for COVID-19 PCR test, they asked me of my gender identity and how I would like to, be registered.
Mm.
I thought that was all very interesting because in Korea, there's no such discussions on, gender identity, especially in more official documents.
Hmm.
Um, and I think even when it comes to, so this is something that I have been recently contemplating on because usually among like the young people, there's this huge discussion regarding like what would you do or would you be okay if your like girlfriend has a male friend and things like that, right? So like would you be okay with that? Like to what extent are you willing to tolerate?
Mm.
Would you be okay with your if your like girlfriend is having a meal with their male friend? And I think that's a fun discussion to have. But aside from that, I think what I feel or my observation to that is that I think people just think it's a like I think that the default identity that Koreans think of like individual is just still very much heterosexual centric. That people
Mm.
think that like people think that like straight or being heterosexual is the default identity, and that's something that is very like normal. That's to the extent that we don't really think about the alternatives that can exist, which is very unfortunate in my perspective. Or even things like, when I meet, the older people or like family during, national holidays,
Mm.
they ask me like when you're gonna get married, do you have a girlfriend and things like that. Um, I think um I think that also still like assumes that, this whoever this person is that I am talking to is going to be straight, or people don't even think in that way. They just,
Mm.
take it for granted. So I think that the conception of sexual orientation and gender identity is still very under discussed, even among young people in Korea.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's very unfortunate because if you are someone who have a different identity, oftentimes you have to then go through a certain level of like dissonance, like you have to pretend like you're, straight or you're cisgender. And I think that there should definitely be more discussion and media representation. I'm not sure how that will happen in a recent future, but like I really hope that that would
Mm.
happen. For the sake of like inclusivity and equitability.
It's really interesting that you point out the differences between the environment, say, from California and South Korea, because I think sometimes we're very quick just to map one issue onto different countries without thinking of the social differences and the cultural differences. And, people, they might watch Itaewon Class and see a transgender character or something and say, oh, wow, Korea's changing. But like you're sort of pointing out, the day-to-day realities are perhaps not quite like that. There is some media representation. I heard this one story about you're talking about like namsatin, yosatin,
Yeah, yeah.
male and female friends, and this summer was the summer of the water bomb parties. So everyone in Seoul's been going to
Yeah.
these like huge water parties, and the discussion online was, do you allow your boyfriend to go to a water bomb party with his female friend?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I thought that was quite a funny one. Just to stay here a little bit more in this kind of thing, like growing up in the United Kingdom or even amongst my foreign friends, I know quite a few people in the LGBT community, and it's never been a big thing because it's been there throughout like 30 years of my life. But amongst like Korean people, the number of Korean people that have come out, like in terms of celebrities or just day to day, it's very different. Amongst the 20s at university, are you seeing more of that happening, or do you think that's still also kind of the same way as it is with gender identity? Is it still kind of secluded or conservative, Youngwoo?
I would say that when it comes to the issue of sexual orientation, I think
Mm,
a lot of young people are um, relatively feeling freer than in the past of coming out. So I have a couple acquaintances who disclose that they are not straight to me. But I think that in comparison to that, if I think about gender identity, I have no acquaintance around me or my
mm,
friends in my close social circle that told me that they are not cisgender or they do not identify themselves in that way. So I think that there's a little bit of a difference in terms of how open we are, like according to different types of identity. But I think that it's definitely changing to an extent among young people,
mm,
because I still remember when I first when I first entered university, and there was this like 신입 like 새내기 배움터,
mm,
and a lot of like student representatives were on the podium like talking about like their college and things like that. And this one person openly declared that like he is a bisexual, and that our school needs to be going for a more inclusive direction. So if any one of you like freshmen are out there who are also going through a similar thing, it's okay. I think that was very interesting, and also very positive changes that I think
mm.
is happening in Korean university specifically, because there's a huge discussion on things like like equitability, how we should respect each other, at least like on a surface level. I think
Yeah.
those kind of discussions are definitely increasing. Um, but I think that in terms of other social circles, like, workplace or because I haven't been exposed to these other settings, I'm not sure if I can talk about these other contexts. But as of like my experience in my university, I think that things are definitely changing.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and I hope like it gets better eventually throughout as time goes by. Yeah.
Very brave of that person to say that at the Freshers Fair.
Yeah.
What do you think is driving this change? Is it, I mean, a simple answer might be like Netflix. People are growing up and or the internet, they've got greater exposure to a wider variety of media, or they're just new people with new ideas. Do you have any sense about because there's a fundamental difference in values, I think, but in Korea between people in their 20s and people in their 60s and 70s. It's obviously sabasa, everybody's different, but
Yeah.
on like a generalized level, what do you think is driving this change, this more openness, or this bravery amongst these people, Youngwoo?
I think, well, I cannot find an exact like one
Sure.
answer to this, but I
Yeah.
think personally, things like, for example, how young people are like increasingly not thinking marriage as an important, like, step of their life. And a lot
Mm,
of people say that they don't want to get married, or even for me, I don't reject marriage personally, but I just don't really have that much of an inclination. So like, and I think that things like this actually um decreases the extent of emphasis that, people put on things like family, or things like, because like I think that like the norms regarding family has a lot to do with, the queer community, because, when we say that like family is so important, or like reproduction is so important, oftentimes that leads to disenfranchising people who cannot fit into that like model of like family.
mm,
I think that generally that familial norm, like traditional familial norm decreasing, probably has been a reason as to why younger people are generally more open to accepting different people or different identity. I think also things like increasing discussion on gender equality, like in
mm,
regards to between male and female. I think these things definitely also helped. I think also it's not only related to the queer identity, but also regarding things like, increasing international students in university, and how that leads to the discussion of how we shouldn't discriminate people based on their identity. And I think that can also spill over or extend to the discussion of like sexual orientation and gender identity. I think all these things intertwined was what um, fostered this change to an
mm.
extent. Yeah.
Yeah, and it all centers kind of around individualism, I think, doesn't it? Because now people are no
Yeah,
longer just want to be a dongseng, an oppa, an onni, or these are all tied to other people and sort of these broader familial relations. But I think now people just want to be themselves. And this is kind of new in South Korea, like honbap and honsul and all these
yeah,
things. It came out as a trend like 5, 6 years ago. That's weird to think of
yeah,
to me,
yeah,
but still very new. I must say this is a bit sort of Latin and Malia, but I
yeah,
was adamant. I was adamant I wasn't going to get married till I was about 60 or 70. I was going to remain a bachelor for my life, marry when I'm old, and just settle down. It didn't. You have all the plans now. Things do change.
yeah.
Your paper and your research, Youngwoo, it was looking at trying to provide protections for the LGBT community, in particular with the anti-discrimination law, and a lot of the opposition coming from the Protestant community here. Why those protections are necessary? What kind of difficulties do you think the LGBT or the queer community here in Korea, what kind of difficulties are they facing? So like before we get to these possible solutions, what's the problem? What kind of troubles can be alleviated through this?
Um, I would say that first of all, there's a general lack of media representation. Um, and I think that even if I would suggest that there are increasing media representation because we see transgender people on media, especially like YouTube and Netflix.
Mm,
But I think it still when it comes to mainstream medias like dramas or like reality shows, I think there's just general lack of discussion in regards to different identities that people can have. I also think that the politicians are not actively discussing on the necessity of the protection.
mm,
Um, or even if there are discussions, I would say that there's not that much of a supporter in the political realm. And I also think that the issue of protecting the queer individuals are very politicized to the extent that it's one or the other. But if you compare that to, like, for example, like providing protections for, let's say, like elderlies, like, and, giving them welfares and things like that, it's not as contentious as like providing like welfare and protection for the queer individuals.
mm,
So I think that just the idea of how the divisive this issue has become and how it's no longer the matter of whether we protect or not, but it's also about like going against the idea of like traditionalism, going against the idea of family, and how this has been framed in such way, I think creates a high threshold for you to support queer rights in Korea. I also think that because and I think that this is important because like the comprehensive anti-discrimination law isn't just like, we should prohibit discrimination, but it's also about guaranteeing that access to social services that um, if someone like, let's say, fires an employee because, they were gay,
mm,
that person is going to be liable for that. I think that's why I think comprehensive anti-discrimination law is very special in that it's not like a very rhetorical or principle like law, but it's very pragmatic in that
mm.
we want to guarantee the access to equal chance to um use social services and like welfares and things like that. Yeah.
It's no, I completely agree. The protections, the access to various insurances or that social safety net that's provided. You mentioned old people. There's also sort of, it's meant to provide for various different communities, but it seems to be the LGBT community, the one that people have the most problems with. Um, just going back to that, you mentioned media representation. Has there been any media representation that you've enjoyed? We will come to the anti-discrimination law, but I mean, my memory is pretty bad, but there was the character in Mine, that strong lesbian character in the drama Mine. There was like a small bit of a lesbian couple in 이상한 변호사 우양우. Have there been any
Mhm.
others that you've seen, or is it just still like not good enough?
I would say not. I would say not in the dramas, but
Mm,
more in the YouTube contents and things like that. There's an increasing like exposure of different individuals. I think that's a trend that I have noticed. But one thing that I would also note about that is that I think that the depiction or the portrayal of the queer community or queer individuals is very much focused on their sexuality itself. So like and they're portrayed as like for example being very um like sexually open or for example being very flamboyant to an extent. But I think that that also creates another type of stereotype against these individuals because you can be gay but like be reserved or you
mm.
can be I don't know like conservative to an extent, you might be traditional. So I think that there can be more diverse depiction or more diverse portrayal of these individuals. And I think that the fact that this is more focused on the entertainment factors, I think that's also what actually creates the narrative that if we start endorsing these like queer identities, then like the social morality will one day like be deconstructed. I think that's also one of the rhetorics that I hear from the anti-queer movements or anti-queer community. So I think that, I mean, sure, like increase of exposure is good because
Mm.
there has been like no exposure in general in the past. But I also think that there needs to be further discussion on whether the current portrayal or current method of depiction is also good or not, and how it influences individuals on the ground. What are the um biases that can reproduce or and how that also influences the anti-queer voices and things like that.
It's such a really good point, Youngo, because it's not just about exposure, but the type of exposure. And if the exposure always refers to their sexuality or it portrays these people in certain ways as very flamboyant or camp or whatever it might be, a caricature almost, it doesn't allow you to see the people as people first and foremost rather than
Yeah.
just a sexual identity. I mean, I grew up watching television and seeing these actors or these public figures and they're well respected in society and their sexuality is almost like as an afterthought. They're not known for that. They're known for being an actor. They're known for being a director or an intellectual, etc. And everything else comes second. Whereas in Korea, that does seem a little bit flipped. I mean, with
Yeah.
great respect to Hong Suk Chan and all the great things, he's very brave and supporting the community. He's like the country's number one gay, and
Yeah.
it's his sexuality which is the important thing there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, with the just staying on that, I guess you were inside the Seoul Queer Festival, working for the organizational team. Now that's been a big event, and there you get the two groups clashing so much. I wasn't there this year. I had a very busy summer, but the Seoul Queer Festival that's been going since about 2000. For a few years because of COVID, it didn't run. What was it like seeing that come back? Did you get any sense of it was a relief it's come back? Was there trepidation about the protests or the Protestants? What was it like inside that atmosphere, Younger?
Um, well, first of all, I work as a translator, so I don't really have a huge decision-making power.
Sure.
But I would say that it was not easy because the the last time we had an in-person like Pride was 2019, and for 2 years the Pride has happened online. And I think that just to get the permission from the Seoul City to use the plaza itself was also very hard because the process was delayed. There were like opposing like people or opposing organization about how we shouldn't allow them to take over the place. But I think that the opposition is always there. It has been there like since like when the event has started. So I would say that the degree of uh the degree to which I was afraid of the opposition was less important in comparison to the fact that it's coming offline and it's finally being able to take place in person.
Mm,
Because I personally think that as much as like online pride is also very amazing and it also is like has an importance, I think that the fact that we're able to have a like physical space where people can feel safe in, I think that
mm,
still is a very important thing because when I was like on the day of the event when I was working there, I could see like for example, like gay couple holding their hands like coming into the, plaza or people just openly expressing who they are. And I think that was very like touching for me because, you know, when they go elsewhere, they cannot feel that same extent of like freedom
mm.
and the fact that they were being like genuine themselves itself, I think is very important. So I was very moved for the fact that it finally happened offline. Um I also there were like oppositions also like offline during the anti-queer like protest and like gatherings. And it was actually quite scary because the work that I did for the like during the event was that I
Mm.
was at the information booth. So it was literally right next to the entrance. So I could hear whatever these guys are saying right outside.
Mm.
Um and they were very angry and they were you know like they were being very vocal about how this is unacceptable, how like these people shouldn't come to such a public space. And like hearing all that really made me get scared, but at the same time, uh so before the event, when we were having like the internal session, the head organizers would always tell us that like even if there are oppositions, it's fine. You shouldn't be afraid of them because that's what they are intending to do. So I think that like trying to like recall these things and trying to like think that they don't like what matters is the people like in the space that
Yeah.
actually are feeling safe and are able to express themselves. I think these are trying to like um think in a way that these are more important was the way that I was trying to cope with at that like setting. Yeah.
Mm. And for example, you mentioned a couple of people walking in holding hands. You might never change the opinion of those there to protest, but for people just walking past to see that, I think that's going to be touching or heartwarming to just a regular person going about their lives. And that's why I think that bravery and those public displays, that's kind of important, because otherwise it's only that ignorance or that lack of knowledge, I think, that it's not
Yeah.
like Star Wars or hate leads to the dark side, but you know what I mean. I think that
Yeah,
exposure
yeah,
and
yeah.
access to it is very important for people. You mentioned, my mind's going all over the place with these questions. You mentioned translation. You mentioned you do translation work. Now, when because I've just read your paper again, but when I look at queer studies writing sometimes and I see words like cis heteronormative and patriarch, the language is very difficult sometimes. It's not something
Yeah.
that you're going to read in a newspaper. It's very academese, it's very academic. Have you ever have you had to translate any of that? Are you able to work between those two things in Korean? I remember looking for the word queer baiting in Korean and I just couldn't find it. Like, so I'm just wondering
Yeah.
about the transfer of those concepts between languages sometimes. Do you have any insight or?
Well, so most of the translations that I do are not necessarily academic. So
Okay.
there's not a lot of that much of an intricate level of translation. But one of the things that I did was I had to translate the subtitles for the queer film festival, like
Cool.
Seoul Queer Film Festival. And there were a lot of like jargons that I couldn't really find a direct translation. But or like even aside from that, I think that the translation that works in our organization is very it's very complex because we want to make sure that the translated version is
Mm,
still very inclusive. Because when we are, for example, even when it comes to making slogans, we try our best to make sure that the slogan is inclusive. So for example, like we refrained from using like terms like love, because that also like excludes people who are asexuals who do not have like the affinity to romantic relationships and things like that.
Mm,
So it's very complicated. It
mm,
like even coming up with those slogans is not easy. So when I translate, I think it's more about um how comfortable people would feel when, watching these subtitles, and making sure that no one would feel triggered by that. I think that's more important part at this point. And there are like our own dictionaries that we use. So if there are things like cisnormativity or like
mm.
heteronormativity, you should translate in this way. Yeah, there are like list of vocabularies that we refer to.
That blows my mind, that not in a good way or a bad way, but the idea that love would not be used because it would exclude people that are
Yeah.
asexual. Because I'm pretty sure for the last couple of years the UK embassy has used "love is great" as their slogan at the festivals. So what was the slogan this year, Youngwoo? I'm sorry, it's
Um,
I put you on the
it's
spot.
so in Korean it's 살자 함께하자 나아가자.
So
And I guess, yeah.
how would you translate that?
So the translated version was live on, stand together, step forward, or move forward. It was one of these two things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That sounds good. That sounds good. It's very challenging to try to remain on top of,
Yeah.
and to be inclusive. Do you know what I mean? Because the rules are always changing, and you try to stay considerate. Um, with this, just before we come to the Protestants and the other side, I'm just trying to stay here a little bit more. Um, One of the things we've kind of touched on it already is that the LGBT or the queer community, they're seen as producing, I think you wrote in your paper, of accusations of breaking down tradition, lowering fertility rates and things like that. Um, how does the queer community respond to those things? Because life shouldn't be about fertility rates, and life is not about
Yeah.
numbers, and there's no standard. So I'm not making that point, but I'm just trying to think, because I mean, it does lower the fertility rate, not that that should be important, but I'm just curious, how does the queer community respond to those things, or they don't respond, or
So I think, well, the queer community itself is quite decentralized. Because even for the organization that I'm working for, um, mo like I'm like working in other NGO and I earn like my salary there, and
mm,
it's sort of like a volunteer work. So there's only few standing staff so far as what I know. Which is why like there's no like one collective response, I would say.
mm,
But I think that there are some activists who try to like write columns or like articles and like have them in the journals to directly like disprove that.
mm-hmm,
Um, or there are a lot of like, for example, like some YouTube creators who like respond to these things as well. But I think that if I also think that uh like in terms of what we can do, maybe uh I think, to be honest, I think it's more about how like I wouldn't say that the inclusion of like queer community necessarily leads to the destruction of traditional values, but
mm,
I would say that the already decreasing traditional value is what makes like queer individuals to be more open or to be more public. So I think that there needs to be more discussion on the causality and what came first, or I think that it's also very important to like propose or try to think of the alternative ways. Like for example, like allowing the same-sex married couples to be able to adopt a children so that they can like, contribute to the family and fertility if that is something that is so important, right?
mm.
So um I I think this all goes back to the same question of how much we're willing to accept the diversity and different forms of like family unions and things like that. Um, yeah, I think that could be my answer. It's very scattered, but yeah.
Are you positive about the growing acceptance? I mean, because there are obviously some people that want to live in the past, that want to live in a Korea's golden age of economic development and a growing middle class where, you know, there was this Jong in society and everyone was together and
Mhm.
but we can't live in the past. It is changing, absolutely, and we should allow change. Are you positive for the future of this, for this inclusion, for this more acceptance, or do you harbor more reservations and fears that it might not get better? Because I think, you know, sometimes for young people, there's sometimes a belief that there's this like Fukuyamian world that everything's getting better all the time. It's always progress. I
Yeah.
think, I mean, COVID probably destroyed some of those illusions, and then Roe versus Wade and Ukraine. But
Yeah.
on that topic here in Korea, are you are you positive? Are you hesitant? Are you fearful for the future in terms of inclusivity?
Um, I would say that I want to believe in a positive way, but I'm not sure about what will actually happen because um I think there are some progress that was able to have like that we were able to achieve. Like for example, like again, like more media representation or
Mm,
for example, or like not only in Korea but in some countries like Singapore recently decriminalized gay sexual intercourse or Taiwan like few years ago like legalized gay marriage. Um so I hope that these like trends, especially in Asian societies, do also extend to Korea. But in terms of the general like actually what is happening on the ground, I'm not sure if I can foresee that in a recent future because especially when it comes to the issue of gender, I think there is a very huge backlash against the gender ideology or like feminism and gender equality. Um, so yeah, it's very hard and it's very tough actually. But aside from all the realities, I think that especially if you want to be involved in activism, you have to be somewhat optimistic
yeah.
to believe that like if you, you know, keep trying and exerting effort and try to be part of this process, you will be able to create positive changes at the end of the day. So that's what I would wish to believe, yeah.
Well said. You need some positivity and sometimes just the trying, even if the result's not there. Knowing that you do what you believe in it, I think is important. There's the Korean economist Tang Ah-jun who always quotes Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, and Tang Ah-jun says you have to be a pessimist of the intellect, but an optimist of the soul. And I think that's a good way of doing
Yeah.
it. You have to be aware of all the challenges and the problems, but deep down you need to create or carry some hope forward. Um, there was this just one more line before I go to the next question. I was looking at the life and times of Kim Dae-jung. It's the 13th anniversary of his death, and in one of his last interviews in Korean, he said that the military government came to him and they gave him a death sentence, right, for his role in Gwangju. They said,
Hmm.
right, we're putting you to death. Obviously, he survived, but they said to him, if you come and work with us, we'll give you a good job and you'll be safe. And he said to them, if I work with you, I'll live, but I'll die in the minds of the people. And if I don't work with you, I'll definitely die, but I'll live on in the minds. And I thought that was really good, that even in the face of death or in the face of great oppression or things like that, it was more about sticking to something that you truly believe. And I think those situations
Yeah.
make you realize, what do I believe, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything, there probably is lots, is there anything we're missing about the queer community in Korea? Is there any like misconceptions that we should address? Is there anything that we've missed out? Is there anything that we need to add before we move on from this part, do you think, Youngwoo? Or
I would say so I think that the one of the thing that I feel in Korea is that the reason why we see lack of discussion on queer community and their rights is
Mm,
because not a lot of people openly disclose their identity to the point where a lot of people just like um don't see this issue to be very relevant with them. So for example, if you don't have friends who are queer, you just think that like whatever these people are going through are, like very detached and far away issue. But I think that it's very important that there might be someone like, around you that actually is not straight or is not cis. Um, and I think that that's what eventually makes people be more considerate. Like for example, because I think that when it's only like within the I think that the parallel example is like for example,
mm,
um when it's only the Koreans, like because and we're so ethnically homogenous and like racially homogenous, when we do not have like foreigners, we might have a misconception, but no one really bothers to care. But I think that when there's an increasing like acquaintances who come from different culture, I think that's what makes people more aware of the fact that what you say or what you believe in might offend other individuals. And I think that can apply similarly in this dynamic as well, that like I think more people should think that even if they are straight or they're cisgender, people around them might not be, or even if, you know, people who are engaged in a like straight relationship, like romantic relationship, um, it might not be that they are like fully heterosexual. They can still be like bisexual, right? So
mm.
I think that trying to like not confine people into like the categories or boxes, I think that's something that I think is very important in um fostering more discussions or just in general making people more like again like considerate or more empathetic. Yeah.
It's it might be correlation more than causation, but these days we see more focus on identity and various communities. But yet, from my personal perspective, just my own thoughts, it's like if you want to be progressive, if you want to be like, you have to champion the rights of groups of which you're not a part. Like, I'm not a woman, but I'll still say, yeah, women's rights, they need them. Feminism, that's a good thing, even though I'm not part of that community. And I'll do the same for the queer community as well, because it's on basic principles, right, rather than
Yeah.
and that. And I think that's one of the dangers sometimes of communities that only champion their own rights, and then you get these kind of conflicts where that those principles
Yeah.
need to be important. But I'm an optimist, Youngwoo. I think things will get better.
Yeah. Yeah. I
It's
mean, I hope so too.
look at it. I mean, I go into university classrooms, and I teach aspects of this in my Korean studies courses over the last few years, and even on Zoom, students have been, you know, openly talking about it, coming out in class and things like that. It's not everyone; it's just a few, but it certainly wasn't like that 10 years ago, and it wasn't like that 20 years ago. So there is something slowly changing here, which
Hmm.
is good. I guess we need to try to turn the other side of the coin, right? Which is only fair, because you were writing about the queer community in South Korea and then the Protestant opposition to this. I guess I want to ask, first of all, like, why not Catholic opposition or Buddhist opposition? Is there a reason why you just went with a Protestant? Was it just, no, that's the main people involved, or it was just to keep it at one community, or?
Well, strictly in terms of the research, it's
Mm,
always better to specify.
yeah,
But
yeah.
the reason why I specifically chose Protestant institution is, first of all, I think that it is true to an extent that even among the religious communities, they're the most vocal opposition. Not only in terms of like within their own like religious institution, but also like trying to persuade public to not support queer rights or not support the anti-discrimination right. And I think this also comes from my own experience as well because I used to be very devoted Christian when I was really young. So like Protestant, and I went to church every weekend. And I think that my experience of being heavily involved in, Korean church actually exposed me to the discussions that happen inside, and how they also like demonize, like, queer identity, and how they sort of like when we were doing, like, for example, Bible studies and things like that,
Mm.
there were a lot of these discussions occasionally like coming up. So I think that my own personal experience of being involved or like exposed to those kind of incidents was what made me um inclined to investigate on the Protestant institutions in particular. Yeah.
That makes me like your work even more now, knowing that it comes from some personal thing. I've spent time in British churches, Australian churches, and also temples and mosques and things like that. But I've been to lots of temples in South Korea. I've never been inside a Korean church. Well, I've been inside a Korean church. That's the wrong thing. I've never been inside, for a period of time, a Korean Protestant community. Any insight to that? But I mean, is it just like a Protestant community anywhere in the world, and it's a stupid question, or how would you characterize it, Youngwoo?
Well, actually, like, I think I stopped going to church when I was in high school. But when I went to military, I went to church a couple of times because, like in military, there's nothing like, there's nothing better you can do.
Go
Like,
to church and smoke
and
cigarettes, isn't it?
like, yeah, during weekends there's nothing to do. So but I think that one thing that I noticed about Korean church is that they are very inclined to show that they have a lot of number and they have a lot of believers.
Mhm.
So one thing that I noticed was that I wouldn't want to generalize, but there are a lot of like religious like institutions or religious like groups within the within the military. And what I not noticed was that the Protestants were the most um passionate in trying to um sway as
Mm.
many like soldiers as possible to come to their um like religious gatherings and register as a Christian believer. And I think that they were even more active in doing that in comparison to the Catholic cathedrals, or, for example, like Buddhist temples. So one thing that I noticed was that the Korean Protestants are very passionate, or they want to try to show that they have a lot of numbers. And I think that also partially comes from their desire to want to um like gain legitimacy in Korean society, especially based on the literature review that I did for my research. Given that there's an increasing level of secularism, or increasing level of or number of individuals actually who do not identify themselves as religious anymore,
Mm.
and therefore they want to retain that, status of being number one religion in Korea. And like, if I'm remembering correctly, like Korea has like few of the top five biggest church in the world or something like that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yes. So I think they really want to externally show that they are powerful and they're a well-supported group.
They have these mega churches like the Yoido Full Gospel Church, and they also have some of the most, like the Protestant evangelicals. They have some of the most missionaries around the world as well, I believe. Korea only
Yeah,
has a
yeah.
population of 51, but it sends so many missionaries abroad to do these things and to spread the gospel. Um, You've mentioned, we've already covered this, but I just want to be clear. So we're looking at the Protestants here in Korea, and they're a large, very vocal group. Now, what are their main, I think we've covered it, but I just want to try to be clear. What are their main arguments with the queer community? Is it just like you're Protestant, so you have to not like the queers? Because I don't think that's right. Because if I think of Western Europe and things like that, the two can, probably should coexist. What would Jesus do? But what is it here in Korea? What in your research? What are the Protestant? You were looking at the discourse. What are they against specifically?
Um, so I think definitely you have a lot of discussion or a lot of discourse is focused on, just saying that this like Bible doesn't say that this is right or um and I think also this partially stems from the idea of how like, in the past Korea had been very family focused, like traditional community, and how they frame the queer community as if which they are the ones that are subversive to this traditional system. And I think also the idea of HIV and sexual diseases and how like the queer individuals are the ones who spread these disease mainly. I think that's the strongest argument that comes from these institutions, which I think is also very unfortunate because that is a very like like distorted portrayal of how the queer community actually looks like, and just but I think that like that message is actually very like effective in gathering that immediate attention. Like if we accept these people, then everybody's like will be exposed to HIV and sexual diseases. I think that's so like strong message that gets so many people's attention so easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's wrong, and it denies people protections. Everybody needs sexual health clinics and education and things like that. We need to open up. This comment might be a little bit, I guess, triggering for some. I'll try to be inclusive, but it's a real story. When I first arrived in Korea many years ago, I had this kind of flip phone, and it had a little basic English Korean dictionary in which I would use quite a lot. And if you searched HIV on that phone, when I first arrived, and this was like an SK Telecom phone, the translation came up as the gay plague. And that, and I only say that story just to show how like institutionalized those concepts would have been, as recently as 2005, and so people are using their phones and things like this that wouldn't come up today. But I guess for many of the people that were growing up around that time, that would have been, some of the, and you're right, that's what a lot of the rhetoric is. It's about disease and it's about fear, isn't it? Is
Yeah.
is there any way to combat that?
Uh, um, I think I'm not sure if this is a solution per se, but I think the reason why that rhetoric sounds so persuasive or becomes so persuasive is based on the fact that the sex education in Korean schools are so um not complex, I would say, and it's very simplistic. It doesn't really like talk about like the sexual diseases, where you can get that, how what you should do, even things like teenage pregnancy, because recently in this drama, like 우리들의 블루스, was it?
Yeah.
Like people were going crazy when, the teenage characters were like pregnant. And I think that the general lack of discussion regarding, these things is what makes that misinformation sound so real. And I think that's how you get so much traction easily. And I think that definitely, so having a more open discussion on media or in schools, like for example, being able to have a more accurate um, education or accurate information, I think allowing people to access these things is very important because that's, I think, the most effective way we can understand that these informations are fake or these informations are not accurate.
Absolutely. I mean, I grew up like every time you walk into a toilet or go into a taxi, there would be condom machines and everything like that there.
Uh,
And I've been in Korea so long, I forgot about it. And I went to Songdo, to the University of Utah Asia campus, and I was giving a lecture there, and I walked into the bathrooms, and I was shocked because like there was condom machines and safe sex announcements and things like that because it's an American university in Korea. But just that difference, that sudden realization that I haven't the just simple exposure to things like that, which I was so used to, which I just really didn't see in Korea at all. I know so many young students that were against the teenage pregnancy storyline in Uri de la Blues. They were like, you shouldn't show this
Yeah.
on television. Like, this is Tumal drama, right? This is weekend drama, Korean television. They were like, that should not be on television. And I respect their opinions. That's what they think. But I was quite like, wow, there's real hesitance to, it's not just the queer community, I think, but the Protestants, but there's that focus on sort of purity and removing any discussions of things that might make people feel a bit uneasy related to sex, right? How is the, let's talk about this power dynamic, because you mentioned the size, we touched on the size of these churches. Now, the queer community in Korea is obviously not very powerful. It has a voice on social media, and it does the queer festival, and it's growing in power, right? But how powerful do you think the Protestant groups are in Korea, perhaps with reference to preventing or stopping the queer community? And I ask this for two reasons. One is that sometimes it seems like they're super powerful and they're stopping laws being passed. Other times I see like posts on Twitter or social media, if I go on there, and there's like 7 people protesting, and you're like, is that it? Like, do you see what
Yeah.
I mean? So I get
Yeah,
conflicting
yeah.
views of how actually grand and powerful these things are, and we all like an enemy. But what's your take on how powerful this Protestant group is, Youngwoo?
I would say that uh there are a lot of believers still. Like there are a lot of people who identify themselves as Christian, but I think more than that, um, they do have a lot of economic power. Just for the fact that they are able to have mega churches. Like, and in
Yeah.
fact, one of them is very close to my house. So I know how, economically powerful they are. And I think it's
Mm,
also very important to take a look at the number of politicians who identify themselves as Christian. And the number of people who are in positions of power who also identify themselves as Christian. Because one thing that I also noticed in the military is that um, all the, not all, but like most of the high generals would show up in the Protestant churches.
mm,
And I heard that they do that not only for the sake of religion, but that also gives them the opportunity to network
mm.
and things like that. Like, believe whether or not that is true, I think that that still reflects to an extent how, um, there are really powerful figures who are able to, sway the important decisions of our country, even things like laws. Like for example, like the former president, like Lee Myung-bak, used to be very devoted Protestant. So I think these still show that it might not be strictly based on number. So sure, the number of believer might be decreasing, but I think that in terms of the leverage that they have for the politics and like legislations and things like that, I think it's still very overwhelming, especially in comparison to the queer community, because what I also noticed recently is that because this was the first online no, not offline Pride in 3 years,
Mm.
actually there was a huge budget deficit, almost like 40 million Korean won.
Wow.
So yeah, it's quite a lot, right? So yeah, we are like the queer community is struggling not only to get like equality and things like that, but also
Mm.
like economically and just to have a leverage. But like in comparison to that, I think that like Protestants are very well established and they have a lot of leverage. Um yeah, and I think that they still have a very huge influence in Korean society.
Yeah, it's a really important point that although the number of Protestants might be decreasing across the population as a whole, they still seem to occupy influential positions of power. They're close to that center of power. And Youngwoo, your work was on more Pierre Bourdieu's habitus and cultural capital and things like that. In South Korean society, in certain parts, it might give you a lot of social or cultural capital to be a Protestant.
Yeah.
In other
Yeah,
parts of the
yeah.
world, it will give you more cultural capital to be queer, right? You'd be
Yeah.
bigged up for that. Where in South Korea, it's still very much to be a Protestant or something will get you closer up the ranks. Were you were you a little bit, I don't know if this is too personal, but I'll ask it. Were you a little bit disappointed with the last 5 years with the last president because he was a Christian of another kind. This was a Catholic president, Moon Jae-in,
Yeah.
but he was a human rights lawyer. He was a guy that was going to come in. He was called progressive by the press. They had this National Assembly majority to fast track rules through that they wanted. I would have thought if it was going to happen, it would have happened there, because now we're back under a conservative rule, perhaps less likely to happen now.
Yeah.
Was that a missed opportunity politically wise, or do you understand that it's hard for a president to do that?
Well, yeah, definitely it would be very hard for for a president to do that. Especially like the excuses that we all hear, like there's no social consensus yet. But
Yeah.
I think even aside from that, when I think of human rights, it's very complex as well, because you might be, pro human rights for economically vulnerable, individuals, or you might be supporting the equality for disabled people, or for example, like immigrants, for instance. But you might not be, like pro LGBT or pro queer, because in fact, like a lot of charity organizations in fact are do have the like Christian identity, or are founded based on Christian identity, and they still support for, like anti-queer like rhetorics, even if, they're the charity organizations and they want to support for the economic empowerment of the, the vulnerable people. So I think that the former president being the human rights lawyer doesn't necessarily, like, it's not the,
Yeah.
like, it doesn't explain everything. And especially I remember during the election period, Moon Jae-in very outright like clarified that he is not supportive of the like the same-sex marriage during the
Hmm.
debate with the conservative candidate Hong Jun-pyo. And like even if his like party, or even if some members in his party support for like anti-discrimination law, he is personally against that idea. Whether or not he meant it, because like, it's the election period, you might not want to, make people angry. But I think that for just for the fact that he was very openly declaring that he is not supportive already kind of made me get disappointed. So I didn't really expect the anti-discrimination law to pass. It wasn't necessarily a surprise. But I would say that I was a little bit disappointed last year when the online petition for the comprehensive anti-discrimination law um, received over million supporters, but it still didn't pass, or it remained as a very trivial discussion in the parliament. I think that part was a little bit disappointing for me.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that former President Moon's statement during the debates. We don't know if he was saying it for political strategies, or whether he truly believed it, but it does remind people that that kind of discourse is normal from a democratic, popular, seen as progressive
Yeah,
president. And that's what I think some people need to understand with the context here. It's
yeah,
different. You couldn't get a progressive person saying that in Western Europe. They wouldn't be seen as progressive. You mentioned one thing, which was social consensus. Now, I don't think I've ever spoken about it on this podcast, but there's this term that always comes up, 시기상조, which
yeah,
is it's really hard to translate. It's like, it's too early for that. We can't do it now.
yeah.
Do you want to just perhaps, you're aware of the term, do you want to perhaps try to give us, you're the translator, Youngwoo, do you want to try to give us an idea of how perhaps Shigi Sangjo plays out in this context, or what it means, or how it's used in these conversations?
Yeah, so basically, I think that term is used to explain that uh there will be too much backlash that, like, these politicians cannot handle, or the idea of how that will divide the society further because people didn't consent, and if any controversial laws passed, it will lead to like social division, and it will lead to things like conflict. So I think that's the nuance and the implication of Shikisangjo,
Mm.
which to me is a little bit funny because like I think a lot of changes that we have had like throughout history didn't necessarily all came from the social consensus, because even things like legalizing abortion, or like even like legalizing gay marriage in Taiwan, or like Obergefell in the United States, none of them necessarily had like a absolute majority of the social consensus.
Right.
So I think that it's the very intuitive way to explain that, or maybe like burden shift to an extent, because this is not something that we want to touch upon because this is controversial, but at the same time politicians use that word to sort of burden shift to the citizen,
Mm.
saying that like, our citizens are not ready yet. We are willing to maybe discuss, but like, maybe our society is not yet. So we will like postpone the discussion to later on. So I I just generally don't like the notion of social consensus. I also think that I do agree that social consensus is definitely important, and if you pass laws that people don't agree with, that also leads to like backlash, and this also leads to like further discrimination to the disenfranchised. So I would say that the concept of social consensus in a very principled manner is very important, sure. But I think that if the social consensus were to be an excuse, I would say that then there needs to be some correlative effort to reach that social consensus,
Mm.
rather than just like reiterating that excuse to explain why they cannot talk about it right now.
I'm completely torn on that social consensus thing, because sometimes I think it's one of South Korea's greatest strengths. Like, if something's happening that the people don't like, God damn it, you'll hear about it. They will rise up, and
Yeah.
they will demand
Yeah.
change. They will say, no, we're not having that. And in some sense, it's good because here, unlike, well, let's say North Korea or China, or there are other places so geographically and culturally close that don't have that reliance on social consensus. So I think it's a good thing that people's voices are heard here. But at the same time, as you say, it's sometimes just a way for politicians to abdicate responsibility. So I don't want to
Yeah.
make a tough decision on this, right? Because if I go and support gay marriage, I'm going to lose these votes and get these, and so they simply abdicate. I think they absolve
Yeah.
themselves, and that's not leadership, really. I don't think. I think you
Yeah.
need someone to stand up and take the shots and take the blows and say, well,
Yeah.
this is what I believe in, and I'll take it. I've often had this thought that if I grew up in 1980s South Korea and 1990, rather than the United Kingdom, that I would probably be, no, I might be anti-queer. And I say this just to say, I grew up in a different environment, and I grew up was seeing, like George Michael and Freddie Mercury and Right Said Fred and Stephen Fry and Graham Norton, and
Yeah. Yeah.
it was just very natural for me, and friends around me at school and all of this kind of thing. And so, it's completely normal, and I accept, and I love the community, and all good. But my question here is, I think if I grew up in South Korea in the 1980s, I think I might be against it, just because of the environment
Mhm.
that I might have grown up in.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that I would like that. What do you have any take on that, Youngwoo? Is this something that we're conditioned by our environment, or is it some kind of universal value that we can achieve? Because it's something that worries me a lot. It's like, where does my support come from, or could it be different?
Well, I also used to think that like the pro-queer stance is a very like young thing, or like Gen Z thing to an extent. But I was actually surprised during the this year's queer festival that there were actually a lot of elderlies um who looked way older than me, but still like coming to support. So I was actually shocked that spectrum of pro-queer individuals or people who support for queer rights or people who are willing to, show up, are not only different in terms of like their identity, but also in terms of their age group. So I would say that like, the older you are, you tend to be more conservative leaning, not yeah, like in terms of like the cultural values and things like that. But I think it doesn't necessarily define like, like what you believe in and the values that you aspire for because um I do have a lot of these sort of discussions with my family, and in fact, my family's very open about that. So I would say that there are different spectrum of people even within a particular age group, even the elderlies. Yeah.
That's really nice to hear, I must say, because you're right. There is this, if we just frame it in a certain way, it's young progressive Koreans and old Korean Protestants, but it's more complex than that in reality, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's young and old people on both sides, and there might even be some Protestant people on one side and not on there might even be some people that support it. I think it would be really interesting sometimes if there could be more positive, this sounds ridiculous, but more positive vibes around the conversation and more good stories
Yeah.
shared on social media. And just you, for example, talking about old people at the festival or the openness of your family, they're things that I think that can encourage those things to be spread like a meme to other people. But if the
Yeah.
stories we're always sharing is about attacks and division and I think those
Yeah.
also spread. Should there be more good vibes around this conversation, or does that make light of a very serious situation?
Um, I think that we definitely need more positive discussions. Uh, and in fact, it's like I think these things are happening to an extent because one of the organizations that partook in the queer festival was the organization of the parents whose children are like children whose children are queer or who identify themselves as queer.
Mm.
And these parent group, what they do is they advocate for queer rights. They show up in the event and express that they are willing to support for their like sons and daughter, and they think that it's completely fine, and they're even willing to step out and like you know create social change in order for not themselves, but like, for their children. So I think that that was definitely very amazing. I think that these kind of discussions can happen way more for people to have a more diversified viewpoint as to what it means to support queer. It's not like queer people only supporting for their own rights, but it can be their parents supporting for their children, or like friends of them supporting for their friends and things like that.
Yeah, completely agree. I've already had these thoughts. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I'll say it because it's honest that, I'll sit there and watching my kids grow up and thinking, what if one of them grows up to be queer? What would I do then? And
Hmm.
it's just these thoughts that enter my mind now of having it. And I think it's good to preempt or to prepare and to be psychologically ready, but cross those bridges when we come to it. So perhaps good vibes are important. On that good vibes thing, the Israeli Ambassador Tor, who's a fascinating chap. He spoke to you about being and he spoke to everyone in the same way. Don't worry. He spoke
Oh,
to
really?
yeah. It's his even to Yvonne and to me. Like that's just his style, and I applaud him for it. It's refreshing. He spoke to you about being a little bit more perhaps empathetic to the Protestant position in their feedback. I mean, and again, feel free to push back on this, but is there a way that it's possible to empathize with the Protestant position, or to try to see them in a better light, or it's like, no, you guys have the wrong take on this and you stay over there?
Mm.
It's a very difficult question for you, Youngwoo, but if you have a thought on it, perhaps, or
Well, I actually during doing my research actually I like I told you I interviewed a lot of the couple activists, and um I had one like very huge perception changing moment, because when I was doing all these discourse analysis, I had to read through what these, institutions are saying. And at
Mm,
one point I was a little bit fed up. Like, why are they hating like the queer community so much? Like, why are they so like angry, to the point where I felt very uncomfortable. But
mm,
when I was interviewing this one activist, and I asked her, why are queer community in fact quite silent, or like not taking a more radical or more hardline stance against the Protestant institution, like, when they hate us so much, like, why are we like not saying anything about that? And I think that one thing that really changed my thought was that, in fact, even within the queer community, there are people who are Christian or who have like religion. And if you really think of it, if it is true that a lot of Protestant institutions tend to be more anti-queer, then these people already have experienced that, rejection from the religious institutions that they have been attending to. And I think that is not just like religion as a like what you believe in, but it's also things that create or define sometimes your family or your community and friends that you get along with. And if you are someone who already have like experienced rejection from your social circle in some way, the queer community shouldn't reject them. Like, that's why queer community is not outright, I would say, like radical or
mm.
like being aggressive against these institutions. And I thought that that was very important because, um, I think, although my research was sort of like the dynamics between the Protestant institution and the queer community, but in fact, the reality isn't like dichotomous, or it's not like binary. There are people who are in between. And so I think that it's very important. Like, I think that the point of empathy is also important because, not for the sake of the Protestant individuals and people who oppose queer rights, but I think it's also about people who are in between as well,
Mm.
and who need that safe space, and who wish to feel some level of belongingness to a greater community, especially people who already have experienced that level of, like rejection and denial and things like that. Yeah.
It's amazing the more you speak to people and you do the research, that you'll find people that don't fit into those two categories, right? And
Yeah.
it's like that middle of the Venn diagram or something like that, but they overlap. And that's actually been my personal experience here in Korea, that I know people inside Christian organizations that are part of that community as well, and they go all over the place. And it's a little bit harder to pass those kind of views, but I think I'm really glad that you did that research and you looked at those things, and hopefully it contributes to something better. Is just before we perhaps I want to ask you a couple of things about your life and advice, but is there anything that we should say about the Protestant community, or that part before we move on, Young? Is there anything we've missed, or?
Well, I think so this is just my personal like take. I think that analyzing the Protestant institution in Korea is very important, in terms of like their dynamics with the queer community. But I think that the messaging of the queer community should be based on something else. So what I mean by that is that, again, like, because it's not binary,
Mm,
the queer movement, or the queer activism should not position itself as if which they are the anti-Protestant or anti-church. And I think that trying to have a positive conversation or positive message to the external society, like people who do not identify themselves as Protestant, but at the same time do not like hugely support the queer community. I think if we're able to persuade these types of people, it's probably when we can have some level of further positive change. So I think that although like in terms of, I think this is kind of like aligned with like being optimistic and like being pessimistic.
mm,
You might want to focus on the Protestant institutions, and analyze why they hate the queer community, and like where did the anti-queer rhetorics come from in Korea. But I think that if we're aiming for something that is more like constructive, I think that we also have to diverge our focus to like other realm or other domains of the society. Yeah.
That conversation is really difficult. In the last 6 months, I've had somebody come to me for like sangam or counseling, and one of their questions was, they asked me, how can they persuade a Christian to accept their, so this person asked me, how can they persuade another Christian to accept this person's queer identity? And it was such a difficult question, because my immediate response to this person was, you shouldn't try to convince them. You don't need justification from that group for your identity. Just be yourself. And if they don't accept you for who you are, your identity is not driven by their perceptions or their
Yeah,
acceptance
yeah.
or their rejection. The person, they pushed back to me a little bit, and I felt really, but they were like, no, it's about feeling seen. It's about not
Hmm.
feeling heartbroken. It's about being recognized as an individual, and that kind of made me rethink the whole conversation and what I needed to be saying. But like you, I definitely don't have the answers to this, but there's something that can and should be done there, I think. And it will probably come through discussions and empathy and awareness
Yeah.
and understanding. I think it's also important to remember that, like, in Korean society, there's loads of groups just hating on each other all day, every day.
Yeah.
It's not just about like the queer community and the Protestants, but these people hate the communists, and these people hate the Japanese, and these people, it's
Yeah.
we need more of this somehow, don't we, Youngwoo?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. I think like that's why I think like the idea of like the homo became such a keyword in Korea recently, right? Like how people are infighting and having the animosity against different groups and things like that.
Yeah. It seems to be, it's a difficult thing, I think, with the idea of individualism and identity and community. There'll be a way out of this, I'm sure. I want to ask you about this. So thank you for your research. But while I have you, and before I let you go, you've you've achieved so much already. Like
Thank
I
you.
really hate to think of what I was doing when I was your age, but it wasn't speaking to ambassadors and winning competitions and doing all this, Youngoo. So you're doing great. I really mean that.
Thank you.
What advice, or what might you say, because there's younger people that listen to this as well, I know, and older people, but what have you learned from this? What advice do you think would be important for young people growing up, going to university, to hear, Youngoo?
Um, I would say that it's very important to like pull yourself out of your comfort zone, which is like not easy thing for me, but because I feel like there are a lot of things that you learn in the like by just the process, and I think that'll like even for me when I look back, I think I was afraid of things like failure or I was like content with where I am at one point, but I think that trying to push myself to like beyond the limit or beyond the boundary, I think that's something that is very important because even for Asia Society program, I was very like afraid of the fact that there are like people who are pursuing their masters and PhD like competing with me with their research, and I was like, would I be able to like get any achievement? But I think that even if I didn't necessarily like win this competition, I think for like again, like for the fact that I was able to do an independent research in itself was very like rewarding experience. And like who knows, because like, you might win things at the end. Um, I think these are all very important, like just to push yourself to your limits. Because I think especially for in Korea, um like people do refrain themselves to an extent because, I guess not only in Korea, but just like in general, because people don't want to feel down. People don't want to feel disappointed. Um, and I actually have been like that sometimes, but I think that it's always very important to try different things and try to see what, what you're interested in, because I think like the more you actively try to discover the opportunities or discover different experiences that you're able to access to, I think that just in like broadens the scope of like the activities that you're exposed to. And I think that ultimately like is what constructs your preference and allows you to understand that like what you like and what you don't like, or what you're good at. Um, yeah, so I think my advice that I would give is just to try on different things, and perhaps maybe like exert like or yourself even to the things that might seem not feasible or probable, because like to be fair, I also have an experience of not winning any award in certain like paper competition or like essay competition and things like that. Yeah.
You can fail so many times, but you only need to win once. That's the idea.
Yeah, exactly,
That's it.
exactly.
You got to get used to failure, and yeah, that's right. Are you? You sound like a fabulous existentialist already, by the way. I'd say if you haven't read any Jean-Paul Sartre or anything like that, that's
Yeah, I mean, I learned the existentialism, yeah, like last semester. Yeah.
there you go. I did that. Like I would spend 6 months being a Taoist, and then I spent 6 months being a Marxist, and then I spent. Do you know what I mean? I'd get really into something, and I would just
Yeah, yeah.
embrace it and live it and read it, and then move on to something else. And I would keep parts of it in me and mix them all around. There was no one essential
Mhm.
thing, which is nice.
Yeah.
Last question for you, Youngwoo, then I guess, are you scared of anything?
Um,
You don't. I mean, you seem to be approaching all of these things. The competitions. I asked you to have a chat about this, and you're like, "Yeah, man, no problem." It's is there anything that makes you go, "Whoa"? It might be personal. It might be international. Is there anything that you fear?
well, even if I just talked about that, you shouldn't be afraid of failure. I am obviously like afraid of failure because like, um, what if I end up, not being able to achieve things that I want? Or for example, especially like during when I work, what if I don't get this project done well? Like, what happens and things like that. Um, but I think that that fear is also what um makes me try harder to an extent,
Yeah.
because like I was also like afraid, like what if my research quality is like bad for this like competition that like no one cares about like what I research in my presentation, and there are a lot of like professors, or there are going to be like extensive like people who grade my presentation and my paper.
Yeah.
So I think that fear was also what made me try harder and definitely put a lot more effort in. So yeah, I would say that I'm afraid of those failures that might happen, but I think that's also what makes me like try more, and also what makes me, like push myself a little bit further. Yeah.
You have high standards, man. I think that's what it is. I think you seem to have high standards, and failure might come, but you won't accept failure. I the big failures that a few failures I've had in my life to date, I learned
Hmm.
so much more from those than
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
successes. But there's a couple of failures that stick out where I didn't get something over the line, or didn't get that position, or didn't get that thing. Learned so much from it. And
Yeah.
those were
Yeah.
the moments that you
Absolutely.
grow. The successes, you just post a photo on Insta and you're like, yeah, I'm cool. And
Yeah.
nothing changes. Nothing changes.
Exactly.
Youngwoo, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you also for like having me here as well. I saw your like previous podcast, and you had a lot of like amazing like guests, I guess. Yeah, and I felt very like honored to be, like, like be part of your podcast series as well.
I like getting to know you, man. It was good fun. I
All right, thank
genuinely
you.
mean that. Just thank you. I'm going to cut it there. So none of this will be on the recording.